All right, good morning, A-Pushers. We are still taking a look at the 1960s and 70s over here in time period 8B. Topic of this video is going to take a look at the youth culture of the 1960s, some of it with the counterculture, some of it in more mainstream cultures, all of it having an influence on our current culture. So let's get to it. So the College Board kind of divides the youth culture of the 60s up into a couple of categories for study. There is the counterculture movements, more on that on the next slide. Then there's political activism. We've seen examples of political activism in class, kind of specific to the civil rights movement with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. There are just a variety of student protest movements that are kind of growing and developing throughout the course of the decade. Most notably, probably most notably, is going to be the growth of Vietnam War protests. I think in terms of sheer numbers, this is going to attract more protesters into the mix. It is, well, because the protests are getting more and more numerous as the war is escalating through the late 1960s, and sometimes this does lead to violence. This is very much a College Board kind of descriptor sentence. We've seen some examples of this on some video in class. By the time you get to 1969, there is the war moratorium protest that happens in Washington, D.C., where there were over 1 million participants involved in this. There was a day of peace that was kind of organized not just across the United States, but in different parts around the world to sort of protest the Vietnam War and other conflicts going on in the world. And that had millions of protesters. And this is all part of like this youth culture movement. This is more than just like a hippie protest movement, although there are elements of that in there. This is also like some mainstream Americans that are involved in this, but we're talking about younger Americans, baby boomer Americans that are exercising their political voice. That large pocket of population boom that's being born between like 1944 and 1964. Well, the first wave of them are high school and college students by the time you get to the late 60s, and so there you go. They're exercising their rights on their freedom of speech. Because this kind of takes a stronger liberal political term, this type of political activism is sometimes referred to as the New Left. This fits kind of tightly in with some of the ideas of 1960s liberalism, using the government to protect people's rights, but in some cases the New Left gets to be a little bit skeptical about the powers of government as well. One of the more notable New Left student groups on this is the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, organized in 1960 at University of California, Berkeley. They are involved in the campus takeover protests that were going on starting in 1964, 1965. They are involved in organizing protest movements in a variety of topics, whether it is civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, anti-war protesting. This is all very much part of the demeanor that they're working from within. And for the most part, the SDS represents, at least initially, a very nonviolent approach to protests. As things get more contentious, sometimes there are, decisions that are made to lead to violence, and this is where we can talk about the Weather Underground movement. It is started in 1969. It is an offshoot of the Students for a Democratic Society. They are a more militant anti-war set of protesters, which seems kind of ironic, a little oxymoronic if you're a militant anti-war protester. This is the group that is going to like target campus research labs that might be involved in weapons developments and things, and creating things like Agent Orange as a chemical agent being tested for use in Vietnam. Some of these labs that are on university campuses are going to be bombed, and so there is violence and there are injuries and there is loss of life that kind of comes into this. And so the Weather Underground is very much a militant radical organization. The SDS has still got some elements of existence here in the 2020s. The Weather Underground kind of like disbanded and ceased to exist in 1977 because of a combination of safety for its members and sort of lack of membership, because they had members that were being convicted on federal weapons charges and going to prison. And in other regards, it just kind of fades into the woodwork of like everything else going from the 60s to the 70s. It just kind of fizzles out and stops being a thing. In this political activism, some of these groups are ultimately rejecting liberal policies, because with the liberal policies like the Great Society programs, they were making an argument that political leaders were doing too little to transform the racial and economic status quo at home. So if you have liberalism that is not doing enough, you're talking about more radical liberalism, and so you do have like a louder socialist communist element to this. In other sets of topics on this, we've talked about the Black Panther Party and we talked about the AAPA. Those are more Leninist, Marxist, communist-based organizations that are actually calling for violent protest. And so this is where the Weather Underground fits into that as well. And in terms of like their arguments, they are also arguing that political leaders are pursuing immoral policies abroad. And this is where some of the secretive nature and some of the alleged war crimes that are coming out of the Vietnam War, this weighs heavily into the protest movements that we see coming on this. This is a youth culture movement, and this is one of the first times in American history that American teens and in their early 20s that are kind of demanding that their voice be heard as a viable, well, population political voting group to pay attention to. Because by 1971, once you're 18, you have the right to vote. And so their political voice is only going to increase once you get into the 1970s. The other end of the youth culture of the 1960s is more with the counterculture movement. And this is another one of these in the 60s where I think it makes sense if you kind of like can see some of the visuals on this. So I do what I can here, but this is where like some in-class video footage is actually, kind of useful on this to kind of get like the right imagery together for you. This counterculture movement is largely led up by feminists and young people. So this is a youth movement, but there's also an element of feminism and women's rights that come into play that doesn't really necessarily fit the same sort of hippie counterculture element. We'll get a little bit further into this. Both groups here, both feminists and young Americans, they are by and large rejecting a lot of the social, economic, and political values of earlier generations. The conformity that was seen in the 1950s, the repression that was seen in elements of American society going before the 50s, whether you're talking about women's rights or civil rights for African Americans or other population groups. This is really like a generational gap that comes into play. And so it is the peace symbols, like the Tinker v. Des Moines protests that were going on at the Iowa high school, where they're wearing the black armbands with the peace logo to kind of protest the war. Or whether it's Woodstock, there's a poster here for Woodstock, 3 days of peace and music here on the top right, and then down here in the bottom left. This is just in like one picture of what's going on here. You can kind of see down here in the very left edge of the picture. This is one of the concert stages, and these are the concert goers. There are upwards of 500,000 people in attendance here. It is really kind of seen as one of the peaks of this counterculture movement. One of the real ideas that are being promoted through this new counterculture, younger generation, is like changes in sexual norms. This includes couple of different things. I'm watching my order on this. I think the more mainstream in modern society, the impact is going to be the development of the birth control pill, or the pill as they would have politely referred to it in the 1960s. Oral contraceptives that can, as it regulates hormones, like we've seen somebody in our in-class video say, it allows women to pick and choose when or if they are going to have children. The development of this in the 1960s is going to really have a huge economic impact and a social impact so far as women in the workforce is concerned. Because prior generations, young women would enter the workforce, but then leave the workforce when they were married and having kids. And because of changes in sexual norms and changes in just I guess standards of marriage, people are waiting longer to get married. And so there's a little bit more focus on career. And whether you're married or not, women are able to control when they will have children. And so there is more control over how much time they will have to take away from their career or dedicate towards their career. I really do think that this is maybe one of the biggest technological advancements of the 20th century, so far as like what kind of impacts the world that we live in here in the 2020s. The development of the birth control pill is just one aspect of what is referred to in the 60s as the sexual revolution. The loosening of sexual norms, where having sex outside of marriage is seen as more acceptable to a larger percentage of the population. The development of gay rights as a movement of the 1960s is a concept closely connected to the development of the sexual revolution. This is not to say that everybody's standards and morals changes overnight, but just like everything else that we've seen in the 60s, the standards and norms kind of change for some people over the course of a couple of years, and this leads to ongoing debate and discussion and conflict and consternation, not just in the 60s and the 70s, but in a lot of ways going into today's world. And one of the other impacts that the counterculture culture movement has on today's world is that it's going to introduce a greater level of informality into American culture. The idea that you can come to school wearing t-shirts and jeans, and the question is not just going to be like, I mean, are you going to branch out from what a school dress code is going to be? It's like, how far can you push the standards of what is acceptable in a school dress code? And so there's this little bit of a even small scale tension about how informal is too informal. Like, how do you redraw the lines of society depending on what particular aspect of society you're talking about? And if this seems like I'm talking about a very obvious thing, I'm just trying to point out that what we take for granted, what seems obvious for us right here, right now, has its origins to something that we've seen in history. So you can't just assume that we do it this way because we've always done it this way. Anything that we do, however simple it may seem, there always should be some attention to figure out, like, okay, so why are we doing this and what are the origins of this? Because if you can understand that, it gives you a better understanding of like how the world functions for us. And I think in the big picture, that is one reason why the study of history really matters. But this is why the youth culture matters, so far as political protest and greater voice in politics and in social issues for young people. But within the 1960s going to the 70s, this is just yet one more area of diversity and tension that's going to, well, be felt for generations to come.